My name is Dr. Ciara Shiggins, and I'm a speech and language therapist by background, or a pathologist depending on what part of the world you're in. And I am a postdoctoral research fellow within the Aphasia CRE. So today I'm going to be presenting research on behalf of a wider multidisciplinary team who all came together to investigate and address the inclusion of people with aphasia in stroke research across disciplines. This research fits into the Aphasia Research Hub, the inclusion sections, that bit in the middle of the Aphasia CRE programs that Miranda described. And I am very grateful to the Aphasia CRE and to the Aphasia Access team for the opportunity to present this research today. So as many of you online here will know, approximately 1/3 of those who have a first in a lifetime stroke will present with aphasia. And it was estimated in 2015 that 33 million people lived with aphasia worldwide. With stroke figures generally predicted to increase, it would follow that the amount of people who will live with aphasia worldwide will also increase in the coming years. So let's focus on that 1/3 of stroke survivors who live with aphasia. Lamb and Woodchicks found that across 60 conditions and 15 diseases, aphasia had the largest impact on quality of life. And as Miranda has outlined, and just to reiterate here, compared to those post-stroke without aphasia, people with aphasia have overall poor outcomes. And these include higher healthcare costs, longer stays in hospital, increased use of rehabilitation facilities, greater social isolation, poor quality of life, higher instances of depression, and as Carol said so eloquently in her talk already, great impacts on the family and on third-party disability of those family members. And of course, all of these impacts can interact and perpetuate with each other to bring together that overall picture on of the long-term impacts for people with aphasia. And I just really want to reiterate that, because I want you to think that if there were two stroke survivors on a stroke ward in bed side by side to each other, that just because one of those people had aphasia, they may be at greater chance of having these long-term outcomes and these poorer outcomes. And despite this obvious disparity between the outcomes of those post-stroke with or without aphasia, we know that people with aphasia are often excluded from stroke research. And when we look into that stroke research a little bit further, we know that within the mental health research, there was a systematic review conducted by Townsend in 2007, which was one of the seminal pieces of research within this space. She found that 71% of studies reported some exclusion of people with aphasia, and 13 studies reported total exclusion of people with aphasia. And you may say to me, okay, well, Ciara, that was in 2007. A lot has probably changed by now. But Caroline Baker found in her systematic review over 10 years later that 62% of studies did not provide an adequate description of people with aphasia in those studies, and therefore had to be excluded. Across the sexuality research, 10 out of the 43 articles largely excluded those with communication difficulties. And in Robin O'Halloran's work, she found that only 11 out of the 39 qualitative studies that informed the Australian Hospital Patient Experience Questionnaire, only 11 of those included people with communication difficulties, which means that potentially the voices of those with communication difficulties did not inform that piece of work, and therefore they may not be able to actually have an impact on the healthcare that they receive. So this has huge impacts for people with aphasia, because what we see at place here is the inverse care law. That is that those with the greatest need are suffering the greatest exclusion. And this actually has huge impacts for people, considering that that research informs the healthcare that people with aphasia receive. And therefore, it may be perpetuating those poor outcomes that people with aphasia are experiencing. You would think that actually people with aphasia would receive greater resources in research, or greater input into that research to actually bring that to more of an equitable place rather than just equal. And yet we know that this is not happening across stroke research. So as well as the impacts that I've already outlined and the impacts of this exclusion, it also has other impacts on people with aphasia. So we know that people with aphasia greatly appreciate the opportunity to participate in research. It provides them with an opportunity for participation. We also know that people with aphasia get a lot out of helping others and making a meaningful contribution. And they're able to do so through participating in research. It also has been shown to increase people's mood and well-being. And it also has an impact on human rights. So the fact that their voices aren't heard within this research process, and they're not having the opportunity to impact the healthcare that they receive, but also has ethical implications. So if we look at the main tenets of ethics, which are beneficence, to do no harm, to do good for people, justice, that research is applicable to the whole population under study, the integrity and the merit of that research, and also the respect that the participants should be shown, which means that people should have the materials in accessible formats for them so that they're able to make a meaningful contribution. So if we really look at those ethical implications, exclusion at this basis actually is violating ethics and the ethical implications of research. But overall, discrimination happens when a person or a group of people is treated less favorably than another person or group because of their background or certain personal characteristics. So considering the argument that I've just outlined, we could also consider that discrimination of people with aphasia is at play. And you may think, after all I've said, why is this happening? Why are people with aphasia being excluded from research? And when you look at the research beyond speech and language therapy, a lot of the discussion actually revolves around the issue of consent. Do people with aphasia have the capacity to consent to take part in that research process? But as we know, consent is a process, one where a person is given information, where they have to take that information in, understand it, weigh up that information, and then give their response, so whether they want to take part or not. And consent is decision specific. So it depends on the complexity of the decision as well, whether somebody may have capacity to consent or not. And one of the most revelational things that I ever heard as a student was that aphasia was a disorder of masked competence. And this is something that Ora Kagan has said, where that competence can be revealed through a supportive communication partner and the appropriate materials and resources. And I think this is something that we need to consider when we see consent as a communicative interaction, where the capacity to consent could be revealed with the same supports and materials that we do when we're supporting the communication of people with aphasia. And I'm not saying for any second here that every person with aphasia has the capacity to consent. That's not what I'm trying to say. But we do know that there are a lot more resources and materials out there that can support that consent process for people with aphasia. So I'm thinking here about the consent support tool that was developed by Mark Jays and Rebecca Palmer, and all the different aphasia accessible information sheets and consent forms that have been developed by aphasia researchers. But fundamentally, we need to think that if all people with aphasia did not have the capacity to consent to take part in research, then we wouldn't have a research discipline of aphasiology. And therefore, that overarching perception that we see in the other stroke literature, for example, medical literature, couldn't stand true. However, you can see here from the National Statement on Ethical Conduct in Research that there are 7 elements in the research process. So sorry, this is an Australian national statement, and I'm just going to focus on this for a moment just to reiterate this point, is that consent is not the only step in the research process. And people with aphasia can be included right from development of an idea and the co-production of research right through to dissemination. So if we are saying that you need the accommodations and supports to include people through the consent process, then these same accommodations should be put in place for people to participate meaningfully across that research process. And what we really need to think about is if a lot of the efforts are being put in to support that consent process, the same efforts need to be put in to make sure that people are supported throughout the process, because otherwise we are still potentially doing harm. So we need to make sure that people have those supports and that that process is a meaningful one for people with aphasia, and that they don't get to the point where they need to complete an outcome measure and then it's not acceptable or accessible for them, and then their data potentially can't be used. So what we wanted to do within the Aphasia CRE and this Aphasia Inclusion Hub work was to really look across the stroke research again and to see where we are now. Where are we within 2020 in this space of exclusion and inclusion of people with aphasia in stroke research? So we wanted to look across stroke research generally. So everything from pharmacology to medicine to OT to physio, and to see what is happening within those randomized control trials. And we were looking at across the stroke pathway and on all different topics, so from balance to continence. And I'm going to present here some of the data that's come out of that review. So I'm looking at randomized control trials that were published within 2019. And those were completed randomized control trials or protocols for future randomized control trials. So out of 120 randomized control trials, I found that 5 completely excluded people with aphasia. And when I say that, it means that within their exclusion criteria, they stated that the people with aphasia would not be included. And then I found that 11 randomized control trials included or intended to include people with aphasia. And trials got into this block if I was able to glean a percentage of people with aphasia that had been included in that trial. And now I have never been good at maths. It's definitely not my forte, but I can see that 5 plus 11 does not equal 120. So what is happening to all that other, in all those other studies? So I just simply didn't know. I wasn't able to find whether people with aphasia had either been included or excluded from that research. And when you think of those 7 steps, because I wasn't able to glean whether people with aphasia were included or excluded, I also wasn't able to glean if there was any accommodations made to support the inclusion of people with aphasia throughout that process. And I was able to see that some studies, although they didn't completely exclude people with aphasia, they did exclude some people with aphasia. So for example, people with severe aphasia or Wernicke's aphasia or severe receptive aphasia. So what this would make me think is that if they were just excluding one particular group of people with aphasia, that potentially there could be the other presentation severities of aphasia included in that study. However, when you looked at the total N, so the total amount of people that were included in that study, you couldn't glean whether there were people with aphasia included. So they didn't actually mention those people, they weren't highlighted, and there was no accommodations made for them throughout the process. So potentially this group is a little bit actually more difficult and potentially more harmful for people with aphasia, because we don't know what's actually happening to that group. So now we've got a varying pie chart here, because I don't know whether to include those other 18 studies in the don't know or in the excluded, or actually are they in the included category? And we simply just can't ascertain from the published literature. And then in addition to that, there was another group of papers that didn't actually say whether they included or excluded people with aphasia, but made quite vague statements in their exclusion criteria. So things like unable to participate through impaired speech, or one, which is even more general again, problems that may hinder implementation. So that could really be anything. And I'm not too sure whether they specifically mean something in regards to language and communication or not. So these are really just general statements, and you don't know who's actually being categorized within those when people are deciding whether to include participants or not at that screening stage. And I just want to look a little bit more specifically as well at those RCTs that actually did include people with aphasia. So there was 11 of these, but 8 of these were in the field of speech and language therapy, with only 3 outside of the field of speech and language therapy. So 2 from medicine, 1 from occupational therapy, and 1 from physiotherapy. And other than that, they were all studies that were led by speech and language therapists. And I just want to focus on 2 particular studies that did include people with aphasia in their research. And I want to show the accommodations and the adaptations that they made in order to make this possible. So this is a protocol for the SUPERB trial, which is a peer befriending trial that's taking place within the UK. And they have made adaptations at all of the stages of the research process. The only 2 that I couldn't ascertain if they did or they didn't was the dissemination or after the project. And considering that this is a protocol, that wouldn't be appropriate for me to be able to figure that out now. So they've done things like adapt their consent forms, their information sheets, provide people the opportunity to communicate with people with aphasia, and really have put a lot into their protocol showing how those adaptations are actually going to be enacted and sharing those materials and resources. And the other study that actually had the most adaptations and accommodations within their randomized control trial was one led by an occupational therapist. And they had also spent a lot of time adapting that consent process, but also putting in accommodations for people with aphasia throughout the research process. I am well aware that as I give this presentation, I'm probably preaching to the choir. Those who are online today are already extremely passionate about the inclusion of people with aphasia throughout all aspects of a person's life. And it's particularly when we look at the LPAA approach. So I know that this is something that you're probably already really on board with. But I also am aware that as speech and language therapists and aphasiologists, we really do focus in on our group, and we are sharing really great practice around aphasia adapted inclusion, information sheets and consent forms, and how to adapt, for example, qualitative interviewing. And we do that really, really well. And we publish that within our own space and often within the same journals. So what I would urge us to do is to really take a step back and take that wider lens to see how we can integrate better across the multidisciplinary team to offer our skills as speech and language therapists and to promote the resources and materials that we know and we use regularly in stroke research more generally. And that's the aim of this project, the Aphasia Inclusion Hub. What I've presented today is the position paper, where we are now in regards to the inclusion and exclusion of people with aphasia across stroke research. We are also going to undertake a qualitative interview study where we interview stroke researchers from across disciplines to see what are the barriers to and facilitators of the inclusion of people with aphasia in stroke research, and what do they need to support them to include people with aphasia. We're also going to look at the outcome measures that people with aphasia may have to take part in or complete as part of stroke research to see if they are acceptable or accessible for this population. And finally, we're going to collate resources and materials to support stroke researchers to include people with aphasia in their research. And hopefully down the track, the end goal is to develop a training package for stroke researchers for them to be able to include people with aphasia. So thank you very much for your time and for listening to this project and this work. I'd like to acknowledge the team that I work with, the multidisciplinary team that come from ethics and legislation, physiotherapy, nursing, speech therapy and medicine, who have all inputted into this project to make sure that we get that really wide lens view on this topic. My colleagues at the Aphasia CRE for their continued support, Aphasia Access for organising this teaching and for allowing me to be part of it, and the NHMRC for funding. And now I'm going to pass over to two researchers who really live and breathe this idea of inclusion. Their work has been inspirational to this project, and they are so active ensuring that people with aphasia are included in their healthcare and that they have equal access to healthcare within and across the stroke rehabilitation process. So I'm delighted to be able to pass over to Dr. Marcella Carr and Dr. Robin O'Halloran, as they are going to discuss today COVID and is this our opportunity to reimagine the healthcare communication. So I'm not too sure where we are with time, but I'm happy to answer some questions if there are any. And if we don't have time, there's my email address. More than happy for you to get in contact or for you to contact me on Twitter. So thank you very much.